At her husband's luxury party, husband slept with his boss, so wife walked away with $308 million. She kissed him under stars that seemed close enough to touch, tasting possibility and risk and the kind of hope that felt dangerous. His hands tangled in her hair as he pulled her closer, both of them desperate for connection that went deeper than shared loneliness. Have you ever met someone who felt like home before you even knew their last name? Hi viewers, kindly tell us where you're watching from and what time it is. Warm welcome to the family. Enjoy the story. The champagne flute shattered against marble as Tiana Monroe discovered her billionaire husband tangled in silk sheets with a venture capitalist who owned their future. 3 years of building dreams together, destroyed in 30 seconds of witnessing betrayal calculated down to the thread count of Egyptian cotton and the brand of champagne left sweating on nightstands. But what Russell didn't know was that his wife had been 3 moves ahead, documenting every lie, every hidden transaction, every moment that led to this destruction. While he thought she was playing the role of supportive wife, she was actually playing chess with a master's precision. What would you do if you caught your spouse cheating at their own celebration party, with a boss who controls her livelihood? Have you ever trusted someone completely, only to discover they were planning your downfall? Have you felt that moment when love turns to pure strategy, when your heart stops beating and your mind starts calculating? Tonight, we're diving into a story about a woman who discovered that revenge isn't about emotion, it's about precision. This isn't just another divorce story. This is about a therapist from Georgia who brought down a tech empire using nothing but patience, intelligence, and Colorado law. Hit that subscribe button right now, because what Tiana did next will redefine everything you think you know about betrayal and justice. Smash that like button if you've ever been underestimated by someone who should have known better. Let me take you back to where this chess match really began. Not in that Aspen bedroom where champagne glasses became weapons, but in a wellness retreat where 2 broken people thought they were healing each other. They had no idea they were actually setting up the most expensive lesson in trust ever taught. By the end of this story, you'll understand why Forbes called it the Aspen assassination, and why business schools now teach case studies about what happens when you betray someone who's smarter than you realized. You'll also discover what Tiana did with her $308 million settlement that shocked even her own lawyers. So buckle up, because this ride goes from meditation mats to courtroom battles, from startup dreams to media nightmares, and from a woman who thought love meant sacrifice to a queen who learned that sometimes the best revenge is simply refusing to let anyone else write your ending. She fell in love with his brokenness before she understood it would break her too. Red rocks of Sedona glowed like embers in the desert sunset as she found him sitting alone by the meditation garden, laptop balanced on his knees, frantically coding even during a digital detox weekend. Tiana Monroe had driven 8 hours from her therapy practice in Atlanta, desperate for silence after months of listening to other people's problems while her own life felt like a puzzle missing half its pieces. Russell Kane looked up when her shadow fell across his screen, squinting against the dying light. Dark hair messy from running his hands through it, shirt wrinkled from sleeping in airport chairs. He had that particular exhaustion that comes from caring too much about something that might not work out. They took our phones, but nobody said anything about laptops, he said, closing the device with a guilty smile that made her stomach flutter unexpectedly. She sat beside him on the stone bench, close enough to smell his cologne mixed with travel, stress, and determination. What's so important it can't wait 3 days? I'm building something that could change how people access financial services. But my current job, he shook his head. They want me to build systems that keep people trapped in debt cycles. I can't do it anymore. The vulnerability in his voice hit her directly in the chest. Here was someone else who'd chosen helping people over easy money, someone who understood that success without purpose felt like wearing clothes that didn't fit. I help people heal for a living, she admitted, watching stars appear in the darkening sky. But I can't figure out how to fix myself. He turned to face her fully, eyes intense despite his exhaustion. Maybe we're not meant to fix each other. Maybe we're meant to build something new together. During the partner meditation exercise the next morning, their hands touched for the first time. Electric awareness shot up her arm as his thumb traced across her knuckles, supposedly by accident. She opened her eyes to find him watching her with an expression that made her forget every reason she'd sworn off men who carried their ambitions like shields. The retreat leader's voice faded into background noise as Russell's fingers interlaced with hers, his touch gentle but certain. She'd spent years teaching clients about healthy boundaries, but sitting there in the Arizona desert, she wanted nothing more than to let this broken, brilliant stranger past every wall she'd built. That night, after the group had gone to bed, she found him by the fire pit, staring into flames that reflected the same restless energy she recognized in herself. When he looked up and smiled, she felt something shift inside her chest. Not healing, but recognition. They were both running from versions of themselves they'd outgrown. "I'll leave for Salt Lake City tomorrow," he said as she sat beside him. "But I don't want this to end here." She kissed him under stars that seemed close enough to touch, tasting possibility and risk and the kind of hope that felt dangerous. His hands tangled in her hair as he pulled her closer, both of them desperate for connection that went deeper than shared loneliness. Have you ever met someone who felt like home before you even knew their last name? Drop a comment if you believe in instant connections that change everything. When he whispered against her lips, "Come with me. We could build something amazing together." Neither realized they were making the first move in a game that would cost them everything they thought they wanted. Love feels invincible when you're building an empire from a studio apartment, sharing dreams and ramen noodles like they're caviar and champagne. Their Buckhead apartment buzzed with the fever of startup energy. Whiteboards covering every wall, takeout containers stacked like towers of ambition, and the constant hum of two laptops running code that could change everything. Russell worked 18-hour days while Tiana handled the business side, her therapy background making her naturally gifted at reading people and predicting what investors wanted to hear. They'd gotten married in Vegas 6 weeks after Sedona, both drunk on possibility and each other. The ceremony cost $47 and lasted 8 minutes. But when Russell slipped the simple gold band on her finger, Tiana felt like she'd won some cosmic lottery she hadn't known she'd entered. "Mrs. Kane," he'd whispered against her neck in their hotel room afterward, hands exploring her body with the same focused intensity he brought to everything else. She'd never wanted anyone the way she wanted him. Completely, recklessly, like jumping off a cliff and trusting the fall would be worth it. Now, 3 months later, their physical connection burned just as hot. Stolen moments between investor calls turned into desperate encounters against kitchen counters and office walls, both of them high on the rush of building something from nothing while discovering each other's bodies like territory worth claiming. "We got another meeting," Russell announced, bursting through the apartment door with energy that made the air crackle. "Hartley Ventures want to see our platform demo." Tiana looked up from the spreadsheet she'd been perfecting, noting how he said, "our platform," even though her name appeared nowhere on the patents or incorporation papers. She'd chosen to stay in the background, handling logistics and strategy while he took the spotlight. It felt like teamwork then, like she was the engine powering his rocket ship towards stars they'd both inhabit. The Hartley meeting changed everything. Sitting behind the camera during the video call, Tiana fed Russell strategic questions through text messages, watching him field concerns about market penetration and regulatory compliance with answers she'd researched and crafted. When they signed the term sheet for $2 million in series of funding, Russell pulled her into his arms and spun her around their tiny living room. "We did it, baby," he breathed against her ear, his excitement making her body respond with heat that had nothing to do with money and everything to do with shared victory. "We're going to change the world." That night, they made love with the desperate passion of people who just learned they might actually get everything they dreamed of. His hands worshipped her body like she was luck made flesh, and she gave herself to him completely, believing they were building something that would last longer than startup dreams or market fluctuations. But lying in bed afterward, listening to him talk about expansion plans and hiring strategies, she noticed something that made her stomach flutter with the wrong kind of anticipation. He'd started using I more often than we when he talked about the future, casual shifts in language that probably meant nothing but felt like hairline cracks and foundation she'd thought was solid. What's the longest you've worked toward a dream with someone you love? Tell me about a time when teamwork felt like magic. The day the first $1 million investment came through, Russell pulled her close and whispered, "We did it, baby. We're going to change the world." She believed him. She had no idea he'd already started using I instead of we in his head. Success tastes sweet until you realize you're being slowly erased from your own victory story. The Buckhead mansion gleamed with new money and old insecurities, each room decorated to impress strangers who'd never see past the price tags to notice how rarely the owners seemed to occupy the same space anymore. Russell's company had grown from their kitchen table operation to a legitimate fintech startup with actual employees and a downtown Atlanta office that hummed with the kind of energy Tiana remembered from their early days. Except now she watched that energy from the outside, like pressing her face against windows of a party she'd helped plan, but somehow hadn't been invited to attend. "I think I want to go back to practicing therapy," she said one morning over coffee that cost more per pound than her old monthly grocery budget. Russell looked up from his phone where he'd been scrolling through industry news, the same distracted attention he'd been giving her for weeks. "Why would you want to go backward when we've come so far?" The question hit her like ice water, not because of the words, but because of how genuinely confused he seemed. Like her desire to use her education and help people was some bizarre hobby she should have outgrown now that they had money. She set down her cup carefully, watching steam rise between them like smoke signals neither of them knew how to read. "Because it's what I'm good at. Because I went to school for 8 years to learn how to help people heal, and I miss using those skills." "But you help me," he said, already turning back to his phone. "You keep everything running here, so I can focus on growing the company." The dismissal stung worse than anger would have. At least anger would have meant her ambitions registered as real enough to oppose. This casual brushing aside felt like disappearing while still sitting in the same room. That night, she tried to bridge the growing distance between them the only way that still seemed to work. When he came home late from another investor dinner, she met him at the door wearing nothing but determination and the diamond necklace he'd bought to celebrate their latest funding round. "I missed you," she whispered against his mouth, hands already working at his shirt buttons. For a moment, his response felt like the old Russell, urgent, focused entirely on her, making her feel like the most important thing in his universe. But even as he lifted her onto the kitchen counter and made her gasp his name, she felt him holding something back. His passion burned hot, but somehow distant, like he was performing desire rather than feeling it. When they moved to the bedroom, his hands explored her body with mechanical precision instead of the desperate hunger she remembered. Afterward, as he fell asleep beside her, Tiana stared at the ceiling and tried to remember the last time they'd talked about anything that mattered. Not scheduling or logistics or his company's metrics, but real conversation about dreams and fears and the kind of future they wanted to build together. The silence stretched between them like an ocean she didn't know how to cross. And for the first time since Sedona, she wondered if love was enough to survive success that only seemed to belong to one of them. Have you ever felt yourself disappearing in your own relationship? When success starts changing someone you love, how do you hold on to who they used to be? When she mentioned wanting to start her own practice, Russell's response wasn't support. It was a question that cut deeper than any blade. "Why would you want to go backward when we've come so far?" The word "we" felt hollow, like an echo of something that used to be real. Vivian Roth walked into their lives like a storm dressed in Armani, and Russell never saw the lightning coming. Vivian commanded the Denver boardroom like a general surveying conquered territory, her silver hair catching light that seemed to bend to her will, while Russell hung on every word like a disciple discovering religion. Tiana watched the video conference from their home office, noting how her husband's posture changed during the call, straighter, more focused, alive in a way she hadn't seen him in months. "She's brilliant," Russell said after the call ended, running his hands through his hair with nervous energy that made Tiana's stomach clench. "Hartley Ventures wants to bring in Vivian as lead investor for Series B. She's got connections that could take us global." Tiana studied his face, her therapy training automatically cataloging micro-expressions and vocal patterns. Elevated heart rate, dilated pupils, the kind of excitement usually reserved for game-changing moments or new obsessions. Tell me about her background. Built 3 companies from nothing, sold 2 for 9 figures each. She sees market opportunities before they exist. He was already pulling up articles about Vivian on his laptop, scrolling through photos of a woman who looked like she'd been designed to command attention. Sharp cheekbones, expensive clothes, the kind of confidence that made rooms rearrange themselves around her presence. 2 weeks later, Vivian flew to Atlanta for in-person meetings. Tiana suggested dinner at their house, partly from genuine hospitality and partly from the territorial instinct she couldn't quite suppress. She wanted to see this woman in their space, gauge how she interacted with the life they'd built together. Vivian arrived precisely on time, carrying herself through their front door like she was conferring favor by entering. She complimented the house with the kind of polite assessment that managed to sound appreciative while cataloging everything for future reference. "Russell speaks about you constantly," Vivian said to Tiana over wine that probably cost more than most people's rent. "It's refreshing to meet a man who values partnership in both business and marriage." The words felt like silk wrapped around steel, beautiful and dangerous in equal measure. Tiana smiled and played the gracious hostess while watching how Vivian's attention focused on Russell with laser precision whenever he spoke about company strategy or future plans. "I'd love to hear your thoughts on market expansion," Vivian said to Russell, completely ignoring Tiana despite the fact that market analysis had been her specialty during their startup phase. "Perhaps we could continue this conversation over coffee tomorrow. I have some ideas that might interest you." That night, after Vivian left in her black Tesla that hummed with the kind of quiet power money could buy, Russell was different. Electric, energized, talking faster than he had in months about possibilities and connections and opportunities that could transform everything. "She thinks we should move the main operation to Denver," he said, pacing their bedroom while Tiana watched from their bed. "Better access to West Coast investors, more tech talent, closer to the major players." Tiana asked carefully. "The company. I'd have to spend most of my time there, at least initially." He stopped pacing long enough to meet her eyes, and something in his expression made her chest tighten. "It would just be temporary. Have you ever instantly disliked someone but couldn't put your finger on why? Trust those instincts. What does your gut tell you about people?" After Vivian left their dinner table, Tiana found Russell staring at his phone with an expression she'd never seen before, hungry, ambitious, and completely absent of the man who used to look at her that way. The next morning, he announced he was moving operations to Denver temporarily. Long-distance love dies slowly, like plants forgotten by windows that no longer let in enough light. Atlanta felt like a museum of their former life, each room echoing with conversations that no longer happened, filled with furniture that framed the absence of the person who used to make the space feel like home. Russell had been in Denver for 6 weeks, coming back to Atlanta maybe twice a month for long weekends that felt more like business trips than homecomings. Tiana walked through their mansion like a ghost haunting her own life, straightening pillows that never got disturbed, cooking meals for one in a kitchen designed for entertaining. The silence pressed against her from all sides, broken only by the hum of appliances and the distant sound of neighbors living lives that still made sense. When Russell did come home, their reunions burned with desperate intensity that masked how little they actually talked anymore. He'd walk through the door exhausted from flights and meetings, and she'd meet him with hunger that felt more like drowning than desire. They'd tear at each other's clothes in the entryway, making love against walls and on surfaces like they were trying to compress weeks of separation into hours of physical connection. "I missed you so much," she'd whisper against his neck as he moved inside her. And for those moments it felt true and real and sustainable. But afterward, lying in bed while he checked emails on his phone, the distance between them felt wider than the miles he'd traveled. "Vivian thinks we should open a West Coast office too," he'd say casually, scrolling through messages from Denver. She's got contacts in San Francisco who could fast-track our expansion. Vivian's name had started appearing in every conversation like punctuation marks Tiana couldn't ignore. Vivian thinks this. Vivian suggests that. Vivian believes the market is ready for their next move. The woman had become Russell's business compass, and Tiana felt herself being slowly edited out of decisions about a company she'd helped build from nothing. She started noticing other changes too. The way Russell dressed differently now. More expensive shirts, watches that cost more than cars, cologne that smelled like confidence and ambition instead of the familiar scent she used to associate with home. His laugh sounded different over video calls, sharper and more calculated, like he was performing success instead of living it. The credit card statements told their own story. Dinners at restaurants she'd never heard of in cities she'd never visited, charged for 2 people on nights when Russell claimed he was working alone. Hotel rooms upgraded to suites when he used to be happy with whatever was clean and convenient. "Who do you eat with when you're traveling?" she asked one night during a video call, watching his face for the micro-expressions her training had taught her to read. "Investors, mostly. Sometimes Vivian joins for client dinners. She knows all the major players." His answer came too quickly, rehearsed like he'd been preparing for the question. Tiana's chest tightened with the kind of intuitive knowing that felt like falling downstairs. The certainty that something was wrong before your brain could process exactly what. She'd spent years helping clients navigate relationship crises, and she recognized the warning signs in her own marriage like reading a textbook she'd written herself. When someone you love starts changing, do you fight for them or start protecting yourself? What would you do if home stopped feeling like home? The credit card statement showed dinner at Denver's most exclusive restaurant on her birthday. The birthday Russell claimed he'd forgotten because of investor meetings. 2 meals charged. She stared at the receipt until the numbers blurred, finally understanding that some betrayals start with lies too small to seem significant. She started keeping records the day she realized she was married to a stranger wearing her husband's face. The private investigator's office felt like a confessional booth for the betrayed, walls lined with manila folders full of shattered trust and documented deception, while Tiana signed contracts that felt like signing her marriage's death certificate. Margaret Shunn, the forensic accountant Russell's own lawyer had recommended years ago for business protection, now sat across from Tiana with the kind of professional sympathy that came from seeing the same story too many times. "I need to know what I'm dealing with," Tiana said, her voice steadier than her hands. "Financial records, travel patterns, anything that helps me understand what's really happening." Margaret nodded, making notes in a leather portfolio that probably contained the ruins of other marriages. Colorado is a no-fault divorce state, but financial deception during marriage can impact asset division. "How long have you suspected?" "Months." The word tasted bitter. "Maybe longer." "I kept telling myself I was being paranoid, that success was just changing him. But the lies are getting bigger." That night, Russell came home unexpectedly, walking through their front door like he owned not just the house but the air inside it. Tiana met him in the kitchen, where she'd been sitting with legal documents spread across the granite countertop like battle plans. "Surprise," he said, dropping his bag and reaching for her with hands that felt familiar and foreign at the same time. "I caught an earlier flight." She let him pull her close, breathing in cologne that smelled expensive and unfamiliar while her mind cataloged every detail of his appearance. New haircut, shirt she'd never seen, the kind of confidence that came from getting away with something for so long you forgot it was wrong. "I missed you," she said against his mouth, and it was true even though missing someone shouldn't feel like mourning. When he kissed her back, she tasted lies underneath the mint from gum that was probably meant to cover other flavors. Their lovemaking that night felt like a war disguised as passion. She took control in ways that surprised them both, pushing him back against their headboard and riding him with an intensity that made him grip her hips hard enough to leave marks. "God, Tiana," he gasped, looking up at her like he was seeing someone new, and she realized that's exactly what was happening. The woman who used to make love to him with trusting surrender was gone, replaced by someone who took what she wanted while cataloging every sound he made, every expression that crossed his face. Afterward, As he fell asleep beside her, she lay awake staring at the ceiling and making mental notes. The way he'd said Vivian's name 3 times during their conversation about his Denver meetings. How he'd checked his phone twice during dinner, smiling at messages he didn't share. The fact that he'd showered immediately when he got home, washing away evidence of a day she hadn't been part of. The forensic accountant's preliminary report arrived in her email at 3 a.m. while Russell slept peacefully beside her. Tiana read it in the blue glow of her phone screen, her heart hammering as numbers and dates painted a picture of systematic deception that went back farther than she'd imagined. How do you prepare for a war you hope you'll never have to fight? When trust breaks, how do you rebuild your life from the pieces? The forensic accountant's preliminary report contained one line that changed everything. Mr. Kane has been systematically moving assets to accounts in Colorado under shell company names. She closed the folder with hands that didn't shake. The student had become the master, and class was about to begin. She wore her most beautiful dress to her own execution, not knowing she'd already loaded the gun that would save her. The Aspen estate rose from snow like a crystalline monument to wealth and ambition, each window glowing with warmth that promised celebration while hiding the cold calculation pulsing beneath its surface. Tiana stepped out of the black car Russell had sent for her, designer heels clicking against stone that probably cost more than most people's houses. Russell waited at the entrance wearing a tuxedo that made him look like a stranger playing the role of her husband. He kissed her cheek with lips that felt polite rather than passionate, his hand resting on the small of her back like a business partner guiding a client rather than a man touching his wife. "You look incredible," he said, and she almost believed he meant it until she caught him glancing at his phone over her shoulder. The emerald gown she wore cost $8,000 and fit like liquid silk poured over her curves. She'd chosen it specifically for this night. Not to please Russell, but to look like the kind of woman who deserved respect even as her world collapsed around her. Every detail of her appearance was calculated. The diamond earrings that caught light like weapons, the red lipstick that made her smile look dangerous, the confidence she wore like armor. Inside, the party hummed with the energy of people who moved money like chess pieces and treated success like a competitive sport. Tiana recognized some faces from business magazines and society pages, others from the video calls that had slowly stolen her husband's attention over the past year. And then she saw Vivian. The older woman commanded attention without trying, silver hair swept into an elegant chignon, wearing a black dress that probably cost more than Tiana's car. She moved through the crowd like she owned not just the room, but everyone in it, accepting congratulations and praise with the kind of smile that promised secrets and delivered power. "Tiana." Vivian approached with arms outstretched like they were old friends instead of strangers connected by circumstance and suspicion. "You look absolutely stunning. Russell is so lucky." The words felt like honey poured over glass, sweet enough to hide the sharp edges underneath. Tiana smiled back with equal warmth and twice the calculation, letting Vivian kiss her cheeks while studying the woman's face for clues about what came next. "I'm so proud of what you and Russell have built together," Tiana said, emphasizing the word together like a claim on territory that might already be lost. The party flowed around them like expensive wine and careful conversation. But Tiana felt separate from it all, watching her husband work the room with Vivian at his side like they were co-hosting instead of investor and founder. The way they moved together, finished each other's sentences, shared looks that excluded everyone else in the room. It felt like watching a performance she hadn't been invited to understand. "Shall we celebrate upstairs?" Russell whispered in her ear during a lull in conversation, his hand finding hers with the kind of possessive gesture she used to love, but now recognized as performance for their audience. She let him lead her through the crowd and up marble stairs that felt like walking toward destiny she'd spent months preparing for. Her legal documents were filed and waiting. Her bank accounts were protected. Her evidence was documented and ready. Have you ever given someone one final opportunity to tell the truth, knowing they probably wouldn't take it? What did that moment feel like? As she zipped up the emerald gown that cost more than her mother's house, Tiana caught her reflection in the mirror and smiled. Russell saw a trophy wife, Vivian saw competition. Neither saw the warrior who'd been preparing for battle since the day she learned to survive without depending on anyone's love but her own. The champagne glass hit marble at the exact moment her heart hit bedrock, both shattering with sounds that echoed through crystal chandeliers and hollow promises. The master bedroom door opened on a scene that crystallized every suspicion into devastating clarity. Silk sheets twisted around betrayal, champagne glasses abandoned on nightstands like witnesses to the death of everything sacred. Russell's back arched above Vivian's silver hair. Both of them so lost in each other they didn't notice the door had opened until the Waterford crystal exploded against stone. Vivian's eyes met hers first, widening with the kind of shock that came from being caught rather than shame about the act itself. Russell rolled over with movements that seemed to happen in slow motion, his face cycling through confusion, realization, and something that might have been relief if Tiana had been in a state to recognize it. Tiana. Her name fell from his lips like an apology he'd been rehearsing for months without knowing it. I can explain. But she was already moving with the cold precision of someone who'd planned for this exact moment. The champagne bucket sat on the dresser like it had been waiting for her, ice cubes floating in Dom Perignon that probably cost more than her first car. She pulled off her wedding ring, the simple gold band from Vegas that used to symbolize promises they'd both believed, and dropped it into the champagne with a sound like a period ending the longest sentence of her life. No need to explain anything, she said, voice steady as granite, while her world rearranged itself around this new reality. I think I understand perfectly. Vivian had pulled a sheet around herself, but made no move to hide or apologize. Instead, she watched Tiana with the calculating assessment of someone trying to determine if she was dealing with a victim or a threat. Smart woman. Wrong assessment. Russell scrambled for clothing, words tumbling out in desperate streams that sounded like drowning. This isn't what it looks like. It's complicated. The business, the pressure. I never meant for this to happen. Stop. The word cut through his rambling like a blade through silk. Tiana turned to look at him fully, memorizing the face of the man she'd loved completely and would never trust again. Just stop. She walked through the party like a ghost haunting her own funeral, accepting condolences for a marriage no one knew had just died. The emerald gown that had made her feel like a queen now felt like a costume for a role she no longer had to play. Conversations flowed around her about market conditions and investment strategies, while she moved through rooms filled with people who had no idea they were witnessing the quiet end of an empire. Her phone buzzed with text messages from Russell that she deleted without reading. The black car she'd called waited outside like an escape pod from a life that had imploded in the time it took crystal to hit stone. As Atlanta's lights spread below them during the drive home, Tiana felt something unexpected settle in her chest. Not grief, but clarity. The house felt different when she walked through the front door. Not empty, but free. Like a weight she'd been carrying for months had finally been lifted, leaving her lighter and more dangerous than she'd ever imagined possible. Her laptop waited on the kitchen counter where she'd left it, legal documents saved in files with names like financial discovery and asset protection. Margaret Shin had been right. Preparation was everything, and Tiana had been preparing for war while everyone else thought they were playing games. What would you do in that moment? Fight, flee, or find a way to make them both pay? Tell me in the comments how you'd handle ultimate betrayal. She walked through the party like a ghost haunting her own funeral, accepting condolences for a marriage no one knew had just died. By the time Russell realized she was gone, Tiana was already 3 moves ahead in a game he didn't know had started. While Russell was still drunk on champagne and conquest, his wife was stone sober and 3 steps ahead in a chess match he never saw coming. The downtown Atlanta law office hummed with pre-dawn energy as teams of attorneys executed a battle plan more precise than military strategy. Each phone call and file document, another piece falling into place on a board, where Tiana had been playing the long game for months. Margaret Shin sat across from her with documents spread like weapons on polished conference table, while lawyers who'd been sleeping 2 hours ago moved with the focused intensity of people who understood that timing was everything. Asset freeze is in motion, announced David Park, the divorce attorney whose reputation for destroying cheating spouses had made him Atlanta's most feared legal weapon. Colorado accounts, shell companies, business assets. Everything stops moving as of 7 a.m. Mountain Time. Tiana nodded, checking her phone where Russell's panic calls had started coming in like clockwork. 17 missed calls in the past hour, each one more desperate than the last. She let them go to voicemail while watching her carefully orchestrated plan unfold with the satisfaction of someone who'd spent months preparing for this exact moment. Media strategy? She asked, turning to the publicist whose client list included senators and CEOs who'd survived scandals that should have ended careers. Story breaks in 45 minutes across 3 major outlets. Jessica Martinez replied, checking her tablet. Financial irregularities, potential fraud investigation, the human interest angle of the betrayed wife who built the company they're fighting over. By noon, this won't just be a business story. It'll be a morality play. The war room energy felt intoxicating after months of feeling powerless in her own marriage. These people moved money and information like weapons, and for the first time since Sedona, Tiana felt like she was exactly where she belonged, not beside someone else's success, but commanding her own battlefield. Phone's ringing, David announced, holding up his cell. Russell Kane, line 1. Put him through, Tiana said, settling back in her chair with the kind of calm that came from holding all the cards while your opponent realized they'd been playing checkers in a chess tournament. Russell's voice crackled through the speaker, ragged with panic and caffeine and the dawning understanding that his world had shifted while he slept. Tiana, what have you done? My accounts are frozen. The board is asking questions. There are reporters calling the office. She let silence stretch between them like a noose before responding. I've done exactly what you taught me, Russell. I've learned to win at any cost. This is insane. You can't just. I can do whatever Colorado law allows me to do. And thanks to those shell companies you thought I didn't know about, I can do quite a lot. Her voice carried the kind of cold precision that made lawyers nod with approval and grown men realize they'd underestimated the wrong woman. We can work this out. Whatever you want, whatever it takes. What I want is very simple, she interrupted, watching Margaret slide another folder across the table. I want what's mine. Every dollar, every asset, every piece of the company I helped build while you were too busy playing house with your investor to notice. I was documenting everything. The lawyers exchanged looks that spoke of settlements large enough to make headlines and destroy reputations. Outside the conference room windows, Atlanta woke up to news that would be trending on social media before lunch and taught in business schools before the year ended. Have you ever had a moment when you realized you were stronger than you knew? When betrayal became your superpower? Share your transformation story. When Russell's panic call came at 3 a.m., Tiana, what have you done? Her answer was silk over steel. I've done exactly what you taught me, darling. I've learned to win at any cost. The silence that followed was worth every sleepless night she'd spent preparing for war. Russell learned the hard way that underestimating your wife is like bringing a butter knife to a gunfight, especially when she's been sharpening swords while you thought she was making sandwiches. The emergency board meeting felt like a tribunal where Russell sat as both defendant and witness to his own destruction. Vivian flanked him at the polished table, her silver hair catching fluorescent light that made her look older and more desperate than the confident predator who'd stalked through Aspen parties just days before. Board members filed in with the grim expressions of people attending a funeral for money they'd thought was safe. James Hartley, the lead investor whose venture firm had funded their dreams, looked like a man who'd bet on a racehorse only to discover it had been limping the entire time. Asset freeze is comprehensive, announced the company's chief financial officer, reading from documents that might as well have been death certificates. Personal accounts, business operational funds, the Colorado expansion budget, everything's locked pending investigation. Russell's hands shook as he reached for water that tasted like chalk and failure. 3 days ago, he'd been planning IPO strategies and West Coast expansion. Now he couldn't access enough cash to pay for coffee without calling lawyers who charge more per hour than most people made in months. The media coverage is devastating, added Sarah Chun, their head of public relations, sliding newspaper clippings across mahogany like evidence in a murder trial. Tech founder's wife exposes financial deception. The Aspen betrayal, when love becomes war. Georgia therapist takes down Colorado tech empire. Vivian spoke for the first time since entering the room, her voice carrying less authority than it had when she'd been spending other people's money on champagne and hotel rooms. This is temporary. Tiana's emotional right now, but she'll come to her senses. We just need to. She's not emotional. James interrupted, voice cutting through delusion like acid through silk. She's strategic. This isn't a breakdown. It's a takeover disguised as revenge. The conference room fell silent except for the hum of air conditioning and the distant sound of careers imploding in real time. Russell stared at financial projections that no longer mattered, while understanding dawned like sunrise over a battlefield he'd lost before knowing he was fighting. His phone buzzed with another call from reporters, lawyers, and former allies who smelled blood in the water and wanted to know which side would survive the feeding frenzy. Every ring felt like another nail in the coffin of everything he'd built. Except now, he couldn't remember which parts he'd actually constructed versus which parts Tiana had engineered while he took credit. How did she get access to the Colorado accounts? He asked, though part of him already knew the answer would hurt worse than the question. Margaret Chin's forensic report had been thorough enough to impress federal investigators. Shell companies Russell thought were secret had been tracked and documented. Business expenses he'd assumed were private had been categorized and analyzed. Every lie he'd told had been fact-checked against credit card statements and travel records. She's been building a case for months, David Park had told reporters that morning, standing outside the courthouse like a general announcing victory. My client didn't just discover infidelity. She uncovered systematic financial deception that goes to the heart of how this company has been operated. The board meeting ended with Russell signing papers that felt like signing his own execution warrant. Outside the office windows, Denver looked the same as it had a week ago, but everything had changed in ways that made success feel like a costume he'd been wearing without permission. Have you ever watched someone's entire world collapse because they thought they were smarter than everyone else? What does karma look like when it finally catches up? As the last board member filed out, Russell understood that he'd been playing checkers while Tiana had been playing three-dimensional chess, and the game was already over. Fame tastes different when you're the villain in someone else's comeback story, and Russell was about to learn that public sympathy is a currency he'd never learned to earn. CNN's morning show felt like sitting in an electric chair while millions of people watched the execution. Each question designed to expose another layer of deception Russell had convinced himself was justified. The makeup artist had done her best to hide the sleepless nights and stress-induced aging, but cameras revealed truths that cosmetics couldn't cover. So you moved company assets to Colorado without your wife's knowledge, Anderson Cooper said with a kind of neutral tone that somehow felt more damaging than accusations. Assets from a company she helped build from your kitchen table. Russell adjusted his tie for the fourth time in 2 minutes, wondering how Tiana had managed to control the narrative so completely that he looked guilty even when telling his version of the truth. The business required strategic relocations for growth opportunities. These were operational decisions, not personal ones. The words sounded hollow even to himself. Behind the cameras, producers and crew members watched with expressions that ranged from professional curiosity to barely concealed disgust. He'd become the kind of man people loved to hate. Successful, unfaithful, and stupid enough to get caught by the woman he'd underestimated. But your wife wasn't consulted about these operational decisions, despite being a co-founder. The question hung in studio air, like smoke from a building that was already burning. Russell could feel millions of viewers judging him through television screens, social media feeds, exploding with commentary that painted him as every woman's worst nightmare and every man's cautionary tale. Meanwhile, 3 time zones away, Tiana was giving her own interviews with the kind of composed dignity that made her look like courage wrapped in expensive clothing. Every appearance reinforced the same narrative. Brilliant woman betrayed by ambitious husband. Georgia therapist who built an empire only to watch the man she loved try to steal it while warming another woman's bed. I trusted him completely, she told Good Morning America, her voice carrying just enough hurt to seem authentic and enough strength to seem inspirational. I handled the business side, the strategy, the investor relations in the early days. I thought we were partners in everything. The interviewer leaned forward with sympathy that felt genuine and damaging. When did you first suspect something was wrong? When he started using I instead of we when talking about our company's future. Small changes in language that indicated bigger changes in loyalty. Her smile was sad but not bitter. The perfect expression for a woman who'd been wronged but refused to be broken. Russell watched the interview from his Denver hotel room, understanding that Tiana had weaponized her therapy training against him. Every answer was calculated to generate sympathy while maintaining credibility. She looked hurt but not helpless, betrayed but not bitter. Exactly the kind of victim that America loved to support. His phone exploded with calls from agents, publicists, and crisis management specialists who promised to rebuild his reputation for fees that made his legal bills look reasonable. But reputation was like virginity. Once lost, it couldn't really be restored, only carefully managed. The hashtags trending on social media told the whole story. Hashtag Team Tiana, hashtag Aspen Betrayal, hashtag Financial Fidelity. Public opinion had crystallized around a narrative where she was David and he was Goliath. Except this time David had better lawyers and a more compelling backstory. When the whole world is watching your marriage fall apart, whose side do you think they choose? The faithful wife or the cheating husband? Late that night, alone in a hotel room that cost more per night than most people's rent, Russell finally understood that winning in business meant nothing if you lost at being human. Money talks, but lawyers scream, and the conference room in downtown Denver sounded like a battlefield where words were weapons and bank accounts were casualties. The mahogany table stretched between opposing armies of attorneys, each side armed with documents thick enough to stop bullets and billable hours that ticked like time bombs. Russell sat flanked by legal firepower that cost more per minute than most people made in a day. While across the polished wood surface, Tiana commanded her own battalion of specialists who'd made careers out of dismantling men who thought they were untouchable. "My client is prepared to be reasonable," announced David Park, Tiana's lead attorney, with the kind of smile that promised pain disguised as generosity. Mrs. Kane contributed significantly to building this company from conception through current operations. Colorado law recognizes her claim to marital assets. Russell's lawyer, Thomas Brennan, responded with papers that rustled like dying leaves. Mr. Kane was the primary innovator and business operator. Mrs. Kane provided support services that, while appreciated, don't constitute ownership of intellectual property or operational control. Tiana spoke for the first time since entering the room, her voice carrying the calm certainty of someone who held cards nobody else had seen yet. Support services. Is that what we're calling financial analysis, investor relations, and strategic planning now? The room fell silent except for the scratch of pens taking notes that would later become billable hours charged to people whose lives were being dissected like specimens in a laboratory. Russell studied his wife's face across the table, searching for traces of the woman who used to make coffee in their kitchen while he coded solutions to problems that seemed manageable back when they were solving them together. Your client moved assets to shell companies without disclosure, Margaret Chen added, sliding financial records across polished wood like evidence in a murder trial. Systematic deception over 18 months, including the Colorado expansion account and the intellectual property holding company. Russell's stomach clenched as documents he'd thought were private became ammunition in a war he'd started by underestimating the woman sitting across from him. Every secret account, every hidden transaction, every lie he'd told about business trips had been cataloged with the precision of someone who understood that preparation was the difference between winning and losing everything. We're prepared to offer 60% of liquid assets and 40% of business holdings, Thomas announced, consulting notes that probably represented Russell's entire financial future, plus continued health insurance and reasonable spousal support. David Park laughed with the kind of humor that made opposing counsel reach for stress medication. 60% of assets my client helped generate while your client was committing adultery with his business partner? I think we need to recalibrate our understanding of reasonable. The negotiations continued for 6 hours, breaks called only when someone needed coffee or lawyers needed to huddle in hallways and calculate how much damage they could inflict versus how much their clients could survive. Russell watched his net worth get dissected like a frog in biology class. Each asset assigned values that would determine whether he emerged from this marriage as a wounded survivor or financial casualty. By afternoon, the offers and counteroffers had reached numbers that made headlines but felt abstract, until Russell realized they were talking about the difference between rebuilding his life versus spending the next decade paying for the privilege of having underestimated his wife. Have you ever negotiated for your future while watching your past get dismantled piece by piece? What's the price of betrayal when lawyers start adding up the bill? When Tiana finally accepted the settlement terms, her smile was winter sunshine, beautiful, cold, and absolutely final. Justice served cold tastes exactly like champagne poured over shattered dreams, and Tiana was about to toast the most expensive lesson Russell would ever learn. The final settlement meeting took place in a Denver courthouse that felt like a cathedral for broken promises, each signature on legal documents another nail in the coffin of everything Russell had built while thinking he was smarter than the woman who'd helped him construct his empire. Sunlight streamed through windows that overlooked a city he'd thought would be his kingdom, casting shadows across papers that would reshape both their futures. $308 million. The number hung in air thick with the weight of consequences and the bitter satisfaction of promises kept by lawyers instead of spouses. Russell signed his name with hands that shook slightly, each letter feeling like giving away pieces of himself to pay for crimes against a marriage he'd convinced himself was already dead. Tiana sat across from him, wearing navy blue that made her look presidential and victorious, her signature flowing across documents with the confident strokes of someone who'd earned every comma and decimal point through months of strategic patience. The woman who used to make coffee in their kitchen while he coded had become a warrior who dismantled tech empires before lunch. Mrs. Kane retains 68% of all business assets, including intellectual property rights and operational control of the Atlanta-based operations, the judge announced, reading terms that sounded like victory disguised as legal precedent. Mr. Kane maintains minority stake in Denver operations, subject to board oversight and financial reporting requirements. The words echoed through courtroom air while reporters in the gallery scribbled notes that would become tomorrow's headlines about the most expensive divorce settlement in Colorado history. Russell understood that he'd become a cautionary tale that business schools would study for decades. The man who lost everything by forgetting that partnership meant sharing power, not just taking credit. Settlement includes liquidated damages for financial deception in the amount of $42 million, the judge continued, plus attorney fees, investigative costs, and punitive damages related to asset concealment. Russell felt something die inside his chest as numbers that represented years of work and dreams got redistributed like playing cards in a game where he'd been dealt losing hands from the beginning. Vivian sat in the gallery behind him, her silver hair catching light that made her look older and less dangerous than when she'd been spending his money on hotel rooms and champagne. After signatures were notarized and documents filed, Tiana stood with movements that suggested freedom rather than victory. She didn't look at Russell as she gathered her things, didn't acknowledge the man who'd shared her bed and betrayed her trust with equal enthusiasm. "Congratulations," she said finally, her voice carrying courtesy instead of malice. "You got exactly what you worked for." The words cut deeper than anger would have because they carried truth wrapped in politeness that felt like forgiveness he didn't deserve and hadn't earned. Russell watched her leave the courthouse with lawyers who'd help her reclaim everything he'd tried to take, while he sat surrounded by the wreckage of ambitions that had cost him more than money could measure. Outside, Reporters waited like vultures dressed in business attire, ready to capture his first words as a man who'd learned that betraying brilliant women carried prices that couldn't be calculated until bills came due. The questions would be predictable. How did it feel to lose? What was next? Did he have any regrets? When you lose everything you thought mattered, what's left? How do you rebuild from ruins you created by forgetting that love was the foundation holding up your entire world? But Russell already knew the answer. He'd lost more than money in that courtroom. He'd lost the only person who'd ever believe in his dreams before they became nightmares. From the ashes of broken promises, some women don't just rebuild. They rise like flames that burn brighter for having survived the attempt to extinguish them. 6 months after the settlement, Tiana stood in her new Atlanta office overlooking Peachtree Street, watching the city move with purpose while she planned her next empire from windows that framed possibilities instead of limitations. The space hummed with the kind of energy she remembered from their kitchen table days, except now she controlled every decision and owned every dream. Monroe Therapeutics occupied 3 floors of prime downtown real estate, the company name etched in glass that caught sunlight like promises she intended to keep. The therapy practice she'd built from settlement money had already expanded beyond anything she'd imagined possible when Russell had dismissed her ambitions as going backward. "Dr. Monroe, your 2 o'clock is here," announced Sarah, her assistant whose efficiency reminded Tiana of her younger self before marriage had taught her to minimize her own capabilities. The Trauma Recovery Program presentation. Tiana nodded, checking her reflection in windows that showed a woman transformed by survival rather than broken by betrayal. The settlement money had been invested with the same strategic precision she'd once applied to Russell's company, except now every dollar worked toward helping people heal instead of building someone else's ego. Her client list read like a directory of powerful women who'd learned that strength came from surviving what should have destroyed them. CEOs who'd been pushed out by ambitious colleagues. Politicians whose careers had survived scandal through careful strategy. Entrepreneurs who'd been undermined by business partners who'd mistaken support for weakness. The documentary crew called again, Sarah mentioned, reviewing the schedule on her tablet. Netflix wants exclusive rights to the Aspen story. They're offering 8 figures for your cooperation. Tiana smiled, remembering when 8 figures had seemed like impossible wealth instead of Tuesday afternoon offers she could consider or decline based on whether the project served purposes beyond profit. The settlement had bought her freedom to choose battles worth fighting instead of accepting whatever conflicts found her. Her phone buzzed with texts from women she'd never met who'd followed her story and found inspiration in watching someone transform devastation into determination. The social media accounts she'd started to control her narrative during the divorce had evolved into platforms where thousands of people shared stories about rebuilding lives after betrayal. "Mrs. Chun is here for her session," Sarah announced, consulting the appointment book that contained healing scheduled in hour-long increments. She wanted to thank you again for the custody strategy that saved her children. Margaret Chun, not the forensic accountant who'd helped destroy Russell, but the architect whose husband had tried to steal her firm while she was recovering from cancer. Another brilliant woman who'd been underestimated by someone who should have known better. Another victory in the quiet war Tiana had been fighting since learning that helping one woman meant helping them all. The therapy sessions felt like communion with warriors who'd survived different battles but understood the same essential truth. Betrayal was just another word for opportunity if you were strong enough and smart enough to seize control of your own narrative. "Dr. Monroe," Sarah said, holding up her phone with an expression that suggested news worth interrupting for. Russell Kane's company just filed for bankruptcy. The Denver operations couldn't survive without the Atlanta revenue stream. Tiana absorbed the information without satisfaction or sorrow, filing it away with other facts about a life she'd left behind like clothes that no longer fit. Russell's success or failure had stopped being her responsibility the day she'd learned that love meant partnership, not sacrifice. When you finally get everything you worked for, does winning feel like you imagined? What's better than revenge? building something so beautiful that you forget why you needed revenge in the first place. The woman who'd lost herself in someone else's dreams had become someone who helped others find themselves in their own power. 2 years later, Tiana stood on the stage at the Colorado Women's Leadership Summit, wearing confidence like a crown she'd forged from the betrayal that was supposed to destroy her, addressing an audience that saw her as proof that queens could be made from the ruins of kingdoms they'd helped build. The Denver Convention Center felt like returning to a battlefield where she'd once bled, but now commanded, each word of her keynote speech carrying the authority of someone who transformed devastation into wisdom worth sharing. 1,500 women filled seats, some taking notes on devices, others recording inspiration they planned to carry back to their own wars. "Betrayal teaches you things success never could," she said, her voice carrying across an auditorium that had fallen silent with attention. "It teaches you that your worth isn't determined by someone else's capacity to recognize it. It teaches you that power shared isn't power lost, unless you're sharing it with someone who thinks your contributions are optional." In the audience, women nodded with recognition that came from surviving their own versions of Russell's mistake. CEOs who'd been pushed out by partners, entrepreneurs whose ideas had been stolen by investors, wives whose husbands had confused support with submission until learning otherwise in courtrooms and boardrooms across the country. 2 years ago, I discovered my husband was having an affair with his business partner, Tiana continued, watching faces that reflected understanding instead of pity. But the adultery wasn't what destroyed our marriage. It was the systematic erasure of my contributions, the casual dismissal of my capabilities, the assumption that I would accept being edited out of my own success story. The applause built like thunder, hands clapping for truths that had been whispered in private but rarely spoken from podiums where the whole world could hear. Tiana felt power flow through her voice as women recognized themselves in her story, saw their own betrayals reflected in her transformation. The settlement was $308 million, she announced, letting the number settle over the audience like validation for every woman who'd ever been told she was overreacting or asking for too much. But the real victory wasn't financial. It was remembering that I had built my own worth before I met him, and I could build it again after he was gone. Monroe Therapeutics now operated in 12 cities, helping thousands of people rebuild lives after trauma that might have been inflicted by spouses, business partners, or anyone else who'd mistaken kindness for weakness. The company's success measured in more than profit. In marriages saved, businesses recovered, and women who'd learned to see betrayal as information rather than devastation. Russell filed for bankruptcy last month, Tiana said, her tone carrying information rather than triumph. "Not because I destroyed his company, but because he'd been living off my strategic contributions for so long that he'd forgotten how to succeed without them." The audience absorbed this with the satisfaction of people who'd watched justice served exactly as it should be, not through revenge, but through the natural consequences of underestimating brilliant women who'd spent years documenting everything. The Snow Queen in the fairy tale was the villain, Tiana concluded, her smile carrying warmth that felt like spring after the longest winter. But maybe that's because the story was told by people who feared women with the power to reshape kingdoms from ice and determination. Maybe the real fairy tale is learning that queens don't need to be rescued. They need to be recognized. When you become everything you were meant to be, do you miss the person who tried to stop you? Or do you just thank them for teaching you how strong you really were? The standing ovation lasted 7 minutes, and Tiana understood that she'd finally learned to write her own ending. Thank you for following Tiana's journey from betrayed wife to empowered entrepreneur. Her story reminds us that sometimes the greatest victory isn't revenge. It's becoming so successful that revenge becomes irrelevant. Don't forget to subscribe for more stories about people who turned their worst moments into their greatest triumphs. Hit that like button if you believe in the power of strategic patience. And tell me in the comments, what would you build from the ashes of betrayal?